Welcome to the channel, Daily Deck. Today we are talking about Lumra Bellow of the Woods. This is a cEDH deck variant and it wins with lands. So if you like really obscure lands with activated abilities that you might have never seen before, and if you like winning in really convoluted, weird ways, then Lumra might be the deck for you. So let's check it out. So how does Lumra win? I had mentioned lands, and this big stack here is all of the lands. Pretty much half the deck is that, lands. But they all do some very interesting things, and it runs less basic lands than you might think, even though it's a monocolored deck. So this is one of the primary win lines. This is Sun-Scorched Desert. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to target player. And you might be thinking, how does this deck win with that card? Well, let's talk about what Lumra does first. So it is a 6-drop, 4 and 2 green, legendary creature, elemental bear with vigilance and reach. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands that I control. So that is super important, and I'll talk about that in a second. When Lumra enters, mill 4 cards and return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Okay, here is the board state. I have 6 lands. Lumra is in the command zone, this is my library, and I have 2 things on the battlefield. One is a way to untap lands, something like Tiller Engine. There's a bunch of other things like that in the deck. And then a way to sacrifice lands. So Sylvan Safekeeper is what I have on the board. There's another way to do that as well in the library, but here's what is going to happen. So I have 6 lands out, or 6 mana available. I tap all of these, and I cast Lumra. Lumra enters the battlefield and has an effect. With Lumra's enter the battlefield effect on the stack, I do something interesting here. I sacrifice all of my lands with Sylvan Safekeeper. These all go to the graveyard. Now Lumra's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands I control, which now are 0. So Lumra dies. I put Lumra back into the command zone, but now its ability resolves. So I mill 4 cards. And then these all enter the battlefield tapped. But with a Tiller Engine out, if lands enter the battlefield under my control tapped, I can untap those lands. So all of these are now untapped. Now I have a few really cool effects, and many of you are familiar with this card, especially our casual players. Command Beacon. I can sacrifice Command Beacon to put my commander into my hand from the command zone. Because there's this thing called commander tax, and you could see how if I was trying to recast Lumra a bunch of times and I was whiffing on lands in my library, then eventually I would have to not be able to cast Lumra. So then what I can do is sacrifice Command Beacon, put Lumra back into my hand, and then I can tap my lands and recast Lumra, float some mana, and then Lumra's ETB effect on the stack, I can sacrifice all of my lands and I'll have a lot of mana. I had mentioned Sun-Scorched Desert. This wins because I can eventually loop Lumra's enter the battlefield effect. I can loop casting Lumra, and Sun-Scorched Desert is going to be coming from my graveyard to the battlefield as many times as I loop this, dealing 1 damage to target player. So I have 3 opponents with, let's just say each of them has 40 life. I can do this 120 times and deal a damage to each of my opponent. Of course, my library is going to be gone at some point, but everybody will be dead and I will not be drawing cards. So I will successfully win the game. That is the primary win condition, and it is a thing that is actually quite easy to assemble. All you need is a land untapper, a way to sacrifice lands, and then something like a Command Beacon effect, which there are multiple of each of these in the deck. There are a lot of redundancies, and there are a lot of ways to assemble these combo pieces. And you might be surprised at how quickly I can assemble enough mana to be casting Lumra. So let's talk about that. Also, if you haven't already, please drop a like and subscribe. Helps support the channel and allows me to make content like this. So now we know how the deck wins, or one of the primary win lines, but how do we get there? How does this deck function beside that? So I have a little bit of interaction, that being Veil of Summer, and there are actually a few lands that do some really interesting things, like, we'll talk about those in a second actually. But then I have some ramp in the form of Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Lion's Eye Diamond, Grim Monolith, Mox Diamond, and Chrome Mox. You will notice that I have a few proxies in here. I've been playtesting this deck for a little while now. So those are our ramp pieces. I have some more engine/ramp pieces burgeoning exploration brood ship, which is a new piece. Lumra can get pretty big, so tapping Lumra to eventually get 8+ station is really easy, actually. I run Explore. This is a food chain. It is a food chain deck and can function a win off of food chain, actually. And then Sylvan Library and Exploration. So food chain is interesting because, of course, I can exile a creature I control to add an amount of mana +1 equal to its casting cost. So I can exile Lumra and add 7 mana that I can then use to cast creatures. So you can see how I'll still be needing to somehow get an additional mana to be able to recast Lumra, to be able to pay for the commander tax. But it is a way that I can continue to finitely cast Lumra. Here are some tutor pieces. I run Crop Rotation, Eldritch Evolution, Tezzeret Cruel Captain, which is a really interesting include because I'm gonna set this here next to this Zern Orb, and I'll talk about that in a second. I run Green Sun Zenith, Nature's Rhythm, Elvish Reclaimer. This can get any land I want. I run Finale, I run Worldly Tutor, Summoner's Pact, Invasion, Natural Order, Chord of Calling, and Archdruid's Charm. So this is an interesting piece because I can search my library for a creature or land card and reveal it. A lot of times I'm going for a land, like a Command Beacon or something like that. Or if I need a creature like an untapper, like Horizon Explorer, I can go get that and put it into my hand. So let's talk about Tezzeret Cruel Captain. There are 2 combo pieces that are either 0 or 1 that are both artifacts. Zern Orb is one of them, and Tezzeret can tutor for Zern Orb. And Zern Orb is a land sacrificer. I can gain 2 life, which is not super helpful, but it is part of the combo piece. The other one is Amulet of Vigor. I can untap my lands, they enter untapped, and Amulet is a 1-drop, so I can get either of those combo pieces with Tezzeret Cruel Captain. So he is essentially just a tutor piece for either of those. Here are some creatures that I run. Springheart Nantuko has a really cool synergy with Lumra. So it has a landfall ability, and then it also has Bestow. So I can bestow Springheart for 2 mana onto Lumra, and then whenever a land enters the battlefield under my control, I can pay 2 if it is attached to a creature, so that being Lumra. I can create a token that's a copy of that creature. So I can make a token of Lumra. And of course, the legend rule is going to occur, and I'm going to sacrifice the token that enters, but it still has an enter the battlefield effect. So I can essentially get a lot of Lumras and then a lot of enter the battlefield effects. Great synergy. Nissa, whenever land enters the battlefield under my control, add 1 mana of any color. Then if it's the second time this ability is resolved, I can reveal cards from the top of my library until I reveal an elf or an elemental card, put that card into my hand, and the rest to the bottom of my library. I do run an elemental or a couple elementals, Ashaya being one of them, and then Endurance being another one. Endurance is one of the few pieces of interaction that I run in this deck that are not land. That is a non-land, excuse me. So Nissa is pretty interesting. It acts similar to an untapper because whenever a land enters the battlefield, of course it doesn't untap, but I do add a mana, and I can use that mana to, of course, cast Lumra. I run Eternal Witness because, of course, this is a graveyard strategy deck. I run 6 for the same reason. Birds of Paradise, Ice-Till Explorer. I can play an additional land on each of my turns, and I can play a land from graveyard. Whenever a land enters, I mill a card. Blossoming Tortoise reduces activated abilities of lands I control, which there are many. Azusa, Lost But Seeking. Root Path Purifier has been a bomb in this card. Lands I control and land cards in my library are basic, so all of my fetch lands can tutor for anything that I want that are, of course, lands. Aftermath Analyst, when it enters, I mill 3 cards. For 4 mana, I can sack it and return all land cards from my graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This has some interesting combos to it. Delighted Halfling and Elvish Spirit Guide. Here are some of these untappers. Horizon Explorer, Splunking Lotus Cobra does a very similar thing to Nissa, and of course, Tiller Engine. This is a mirror pool. So I'm going to start talking about this big ol' mass of lands because this is what the deck is about. This is, of course, in Japanese, so if you can read Japanese, great. This has an ability for 5, I can tap it and make a token that's a copy of a creature I control, which will likely be a Lumra. So that's the most important ability on this. We've talked about Sunscorched Desert, we've talked about Command Beacon. I run some basics, of course, Deserted Temple, Petrified Field, Wasteland. There are some interesting loops. So if an opponent is covered with protection by, let's say, a One Ring or something, I can just remove their resources and then win on my next turn or something like that. There are a few ways to win through the One Ring protection, and if you're interested in some more win lines, I will drop a link in the description with some primers that are really helpful, because I don't have enough time to talk about all of the different convoluted win lines in this deck, and honestly, I probably don't know all of them. Boseiju, some fetch lands, Field of the Dead. There are a lot of times when this deck has 7 or more lands on, like, I don't know, turn 1 or turn 2, which is wild. Talon Gates is a piece of removal or even a piece of protection for Lumra. Sanctum of Eternity is a very similar Command Beacon effect. Lotus Field, Cavern of Souls, usually naming Elemental, Gaia's Cradle. Emergent Zone is a way I can make my stuff have flash. Isengard, also known as Boseiju Who Shelters All, protects instant and sorcery spells from being countered. A bunch of other really cool, really weird lands that you might have never seen before. That's a script mine. But this is the deck. I hope you get the gist of what this deck does. It is super fun. It is kind of turbo-y at sometimes. I hope you enjoyed the video. Also, if you haven't already, drop a like and subscribe, and drop a comment if you love this deck. Peace.